Hey everybody, welcome back to another video, and today I'm talking about something to think about before you act. But before I jump into this video, go ahead and hit the subscribe button if you're not already subscribed, and if you like today's video, make sure you give it a thumbs up. So the idea that I got for today's video comes from a book by a philosopher named Jean Paul Sartre called Existentialism is a Humanism. Now, I was flipping through this book. I read this book a while ago, but I thought there was an interesting idea I wanted to reevaluate. And to jump into this philosopher, Jean Paul Sartre is a writer that I really like. He's both a philosopher and he's also written some novels back when he was alive. And Jean Paul Sartre is what we might consider to be an individualist. He is the father of existentialism, and existentialism overall seems to be a pretty individualist philosophy. So when I talk about individualism, I'm specifically talking about the extent to which our identity as an individualist is more so around ourselves, our preferences, our own choices, and our own way of life. An individualist is going to essentially map out their own life in terms of their own individual self-interest. And when you look at certain Western countries like America and other European countries, we typically tend to have a more individualist framework through which we live our lives. Whereas other Eastern cultures like China or India typically tend to have a more collectivist way of looking at things, where they view things from the framework of the groups to which they belong, like their family or their community. And they think about themselves as one part of that bigger collective whole. And so, like I mentioned before, Jean Paul Sartre and existentialism typically takes a more individualist focus to things. In this book, though, Jean Paul Sartre provides an interesting way to examine the way that we're living our lives that actually takes other people in the world into consideration when we're actually thinking about our individual actions. And I thought it was interesting and I want to talk about it today. So a big part of existentialism, one of the big famous quotes of existentialism that encompasses what the philosophy believes or what the philosophy teaches, is that existence precedes essence. What that sentence means is that when we talk about essence, we're talking about who we are as an individual, our personality, our nature, essentially the things that make us who we are as a person is our essence. And when existentialists say existence precedes essence, what they mean is that your existence is going to determine your essence. And the choices you make in your life are the things that determine you, rather than vice versa. There have been some people who believe, some philosophers and writers who have argued that your essence determines who you are. You're born with certain characteristics or certain, genetic predispositions, and that determines who you are. And while I do think the existentialists are wrong in the sense that your essence is entirely determined by your life choices, I do think they make a valuable point when they talk about the role that our own individual choices do play in making who we are. Basically, as I live my life making certain choices, those choices are going to play a fundamental role in determining who I am. Who I am is the byproduct of the things I choose to do and the decisions I make in my life. So in this book, Jean Paul Sartre comes up with this idea or this concept that he calls anguish. And this term anguish is something that he believes all human beings experience and all human beings have. Now the term anguish sounds kind of gloomy, but it actually is, I think, a lot less gloomy than it initially sounds. And this idea of anguish, which is key to existentialism, is that we as humans, we bear the responsibility of our choices in life. Another key concept in existentialism is responsibility. Responsibility is very big because if we realize that who we are is the byproduct of the choices that we make, then we realize that we bear the responsibility of who we will become because we bear the responsibility of our own choices. And so when it comes to the concept of anguish, Jean Paul Sartre defines anguish as the responsibility we face when we make our decisions regarding how we want the world to be. This is how Jean Paul Sartre describes it in this book here. He says, "When we say that man chooses himself, not only do we mean that each of us must choose himself, but also that in choosing himself, he is choosing for all men. In fact, in creating the man each of us wills ourselves to be, there is not a single one of our actions that does not at the same time create an image of man as we think he ought to be. Existentialists like to say that man is in anguish. This is what they mean. A man who commits himself and who realizes that he is not only the individual that he chooses to be, but also a legislator choosing at the same time what humanity as a whole should be, cannot help but be aware of his own full and profound responsibility." So when we take the perspective of anguish as an individual, this existentialist concept of anguish, and we apply it to our own lives, what we realize is that when we choose to behave in some way, when we make a certain choice in our lives and we conduct ourselves a certain way, we're essentially broadcasting to the world what we think a person should be. An example of this is if I live my life being conscious of the environment and making sure that I don't litter or that I don't pollute, I'm essentially telling people I believe that pollution is bad and I believe that people should not pollute because I don't pollute. This concept of anguish is essentially saying the way that you choose to live your life should be a representation of how you think other people should live their lives. So whenever you're doing something, you always have to ask yourself, if everyone behaved the way that I'm behaving right now, would this make the kind of world that I want to live in? Would this make the world a better place? Or if everyone else behaved the way I was behaving right now, would that make the world a worse place? Would I want to live in the world that I am creating through my own actions if everyone else lived in this same way? And Sartre, he elaborates a bit more here on this point. Certainly, many people believe that their actions involve no one but themselves, and were we to ask them, but what if everyone acted that way? They would shrug their shoulders and reply, but everyone does not act that way. In truth, however, one should always ask oneself, what would happen if everyone did what I am doing? I think this is a very useful way of thinking because it allows us to pause and to reflect on what we are doing and what kind of a world we are creating or helping to create through our actions. If I am treating people in a negative, disrespectful, rude way, essentially I have to think to myself, well, what if everyone treated people in their life this way? If I lived my life in this way, would it make the world the kind of place I want to live in? And furthermore, would this make the world a better place for my kids and my grandkids? Because if I'm being honest with you, and I'm sure if you're being honest with yourself, oftentimes I think we fall short of the ideal standard that we have for ourselves in terms of how we want to act in the world. And actually pausing and reflecting over this notion of anguish and the responsibility that our actions hold for making the kind of world we want to be in, I think that allows us to take a moment to really think about what we're doing before we do it and to say, does this make the world the kind of place I want it to be? A world that's consistent with my own values and my own beliefs and principles. Now, granted, I do think that there are some potential limitations with this view of looking at things, specifically within certain contexts. I think that this concept of anguish is typically best for thinking about maybe morals and the way that we treat other people. Because obviously there are some decisions we make in our life that, sure, that decision might be what we want for our lives, but that's not necessarily how we think everyone else must behave. If someone wakes up and spends their Saturdays going on a jog and exercising, it doesn't mean that that person believes this is what everyone else should do on their Saturday too. That person might just think that this is what works for me and this is what I do, but if other people do something different, that works for them. So obviously there are these choices we have in life that are much more individual based and we don't necessarily think should extend to other people. Whereas in other contexts, when it comes to treating people with basic dignity and respect, or, you know, taking care of the planet or whatever it might be, those are certain activities that we might really believe that it's actually important that everyone behaves in a way that's similar to this value that we might hold, because if not, it actually might have a negative benefit on the world. Whereas there are other choices people are going to make that it's, at the end of the day, it's different strokes for different folks. It's whatever works for them, as long as it's not having a negative effect on other people. So I think that there are some cases where thinking in terms of anguish and the responsibility we each have for living in a way that's consistent with what we think everyone else should do, it's not always going to apply. But I think in cases of morality and treating other people a certain way and engaging with certain responsibilities we might have with our communities, then sure, it's important to think in terms of, if everyone acted the way I'm acting, would this make the world a better place, or would it make it a worse place? So getting back to my beginning points about individualism and collectivism, this idea of anguish and the responsibility that an individual can hold with their own individual actions actually gives an interesting twist to thinking about individualism and individualist preferences. On the one hand, sure, I can live my life in a way that I want to, that fits me, but I also need to take into consideration how my own individual choices affect the public or affect the world as a whole. And so thinking about individual choices and how they affect other people from a collective framework is an interesting way of thinking. What do you all think? Do you think this idea of anguish and thinking about your own actions through, you know, what if everyone else behaved this way? Do you think that's a useful way of thinking about things before you act? Let me know in the comments below if you like or dislike this idea. Maybe you have certain problems with existentialism and you think it has a flawed way of looking at human choices. And once again, if you liked this video, give it a thumbs up. Anyway, that's it for today's video. I hope you all enjoyed it, and I'll see you all next time. Bye.